Good afternoon, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog on the Synagogue News. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times, and we have got a very interesting show to be discussing with you guys, or some very interesting topics to be discussing with you guys today, I should say. Very interesting show that we're putting forward. Got a lot to be I actually have my banner up already. Sorry. Got a lot to be discussing in regards to Israel. I want to try and get to some stuff around China. And there was also talk that the World Council of Churches may be expelling the Russian Orthodox Church over the war in Ukraine. So we're going to read a little bit about that, give our opinions, all that good fun stuff. Definitely a interesting episode for you here today. Excuse me. I'm going to go through some channel housekeeping here real quick. So those of you who are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so and hitting that bell to get notified every time we go live. I am going to try and make it a habit, not just of going live every Tuesday and Thursday, but I'm going to try and make it a habit of going live every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time so that we have a set time and you guys can have a little bit of an expectation of, when the show is going to be on. We are also going to very shortly expand the program. I'm not sure when exactly, but at some point, I'm going to be setting up a Patreon that is specific for this channel, separated from the other channel's Patreon. And we will be posting a extra episode or two onto the Patreon every week. And those of you who do decide to give to the Patreon will then be able to get an extra episode of The Watchdog if indeed you see fit. These will not be episodes that will be strictly on Patreon and then given later on. Rather, they will be strictly on Patreon, period, kind of like a subscription-based service. And eventually we'll be moving that to our own website, right? Not kind of like you have from all these other news anchors, right? They give you the free stuff, but then they also have multiple episodes a week that are not free. And of course, that's because we want to incentivize people to actually want to give to the Patreon, right? Been trying to turn this into a full-time job. Well, I got to actually give you guys some product in order to do that, right? And so that's what we're going to try and do. Nonetheless, our free episodes here on YouTube, 1 p.m. Mountain Time, every Tuesday and Thursday, Lord willing. Definitely hit that bell to get notified and subscribe so that we show up in your live feed. Also, when you're sharing this, please do share it to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Parler, Minds, Gab, Facebook, Twitter, MeWe, anything that you are currently on. I am on most of them, and you can tag me at the Synagogue, though I will have a different display name in all of them. The Synagogue will be the name you can actually reach me at. Want to specifically take some time to recommend Gab, Parler, and Minds as alternative social media platforms. If you are on Twitter, Gab, Parler, and Minds are Twitter clones. The difference being that they actually do defend your freedom of speech. And by the way, if you don't consider yourself politically right-wing, that's perfectly fine. Free speech is for everybody, not just people who are politically right-wing. And by the way, the more independents, left-wingers, libertarians, and so on that actually show up on these websites, the less of an echo chamber we actually get on these websites. So if you're on Twitter, you might as well get on Gab. If you're on Twitter, you might as well get on Parler. If you're on Twitter, you might as well get on Minds. And if you like Facebook, well, guess what? There is Facebook clones that will also defend your free speech, namely Telegram and MeWe. So you might as well get on those as well. And lastly, with that particular thing, I want to recommend that you guys get Rumble accounts. Rumble is a YouTube clone that will be, the free speech platform for video streaming. We do try to post videos of the Watchdog after the fact, meaning not live, on Rumble. I think that's incredibly important for those of you who are fans of this show, only because we have had videos taken down before. The more popular we get, the more likely it will be that videos do get taken down. So if you want to consistently get this program, or at least have a backup just in case it does get taken down at some point, it would definitely be a good idea for you to get a Rumble account, follow your boy there, and start watching videos on that website. Excuse me. Next thing I want to talk about here is the aforementioned Patreon and PayPal. If you guys are interested in helping me turn this into a career, if you think that this is good information that needs to be out there, please do consider giving either to the Patreon or to the PayPal. Through the PayPal, you can give one-time donations of as much or as little as you like. I don't do tiers. And through the Patreon, you can give as much or as little as you like on a monthly subscription service. Again, I do not do tiers, meaning that if you want to give as little as 50 cents, 99 cents, whatever, you certainly can. If you want to give as much as $100,000, you certainly can. Obviously, nobody's about to fork over $100,000, but it's just the point is just to say um, that these are, give as much as you wish kind of platforms. And I do that specifically so that you guys can determine the value for yourselves, as well as not actually have any sort of financial difficulties accrue to you, excuse me, by virtue of contributing to this channel. Last thing I want to say is we did have, excuse me, a scheduled interview with Pastor Tony Spell that ended up falling through. The reason it ended up falling through was because he is actually currently being, I guess the only real word to use is attacked, to be honest with you. But the fire department there in central Louisiana is attempting to take away his occupancy license, which would mean that they can no longer have church services. This is just the latest in the minor, but nonetheless still persecutory actions on the part of the Louisiana state government and central city government. We are going to try and reschedule that for some time here in the near future. Whether or not it happens, we will see. But know that I am indeed attempting to get Tony Spell back on, or at least on, because he actually didn't come on. But we are attempting to reschedule that interview with the good pastor. And I appreciate you guys who are interested in watching that if and when it does occur, Lord willing. That is the end of our, excuse me, channel housekeeping. So I want to go ahead and jump into the show for today. I want to briefly mention before we get into the articles, my sort of pre-article discussion, if you will, something that I found incredibly peculiar, which is that we had a lot of big happenings surrounding Israel and, specifically surrounding Israel, but also Russia. On the day of the super blood flower moon eclipse. Now, I am somewhat superstitious, kind of sort of believe that lunar eclipses are heralds of bad juju. I know that a lot of people probably hear that and think that's just the most bizarre thing in the world, and maybe even turn the show off right at that point. However, it's a trend, or not a trend, it's a, what would I say? This has been something which informs me more often than not. Every single time there is one of these astronomical events which seems to herald some sort of bad juju, I immediately go and look for what's going on with Israel, what's going on with the World Council of Churches, what's going on with Pope Francis. And without fail, there is some big news. Without fail. Does that mean that I'm right, or is that just coincidental? I don't know. But I'm just saying, I do believe in the supernatural. I do believe in the spiritual. I do believe that these sorts of things are heralds of bad things to come. They are signs. In fact, the book of Genesis clearly says that's why the stars, the sun, the moon, and all that exists, is not just for times and seasons, but also for signs. And I think we have good evidence of that again here today. And I'm sorry that that probably sounds a little bizarre. But we're going to go ahead and get right into that. I do see Cryptomaria is in the live chat. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. Let's go ahead and jump right into the articles today. And I'm going to get my screen shared here. I want to ask the question, will the USA formally recognize the Nakba? Again, we are asking the question, will the USA formally recognize the Nakba? Now, for those of you who do not know, Nakba is actually shortened version of Nakba, which is an Arabic word meaning the disaster or the cataclysm. And it is sometimes known in English as the Palestinian catastrophe as well. Basically, this, quote, event is said to be the destruction of Palestine at the hands of Israel in 1948 via the permanent displacement of the Palestinians out of Israel. And, into different Palestinian refugee camps, the occupied West Bank, quote unquote occupied West Bank, I believe that is more accurately described as Judah and Samaria, the Gaza Strip, so on and so forth. It's an exodus of about 700,000 Palestinians and depopulation of roughly 500 Palestinian villages. Now, it is important to note that the Nakba, in the way that it is described in Arab circles, did not ever happen. It's not a thing that occurred. What do I mean by that? Well, they like to pretend that Israel, in establishing its state, actually forced 700,000 Palestinians out of the country, actually forced 500 Palestinian villages to be depopulated. That is a lie. It is simply not true. What actually happened is that the surrounding Arab nations said, hey, you guys leave this state real quick. We're going to throw the Jews into the sea. And then everybody listened, and the armies failed to throw the Jews into the sea. But it is perfectly legal to be an Arab in the state of Israel. There's 1.4 million Arabs in the state of Israel to this day. And on top of that, by the way, there's 20 plus different Arab countries around the world, including but not limited to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Afghanistan and Syria and Jordan and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, it's also not accurate at all to say that this is a forced exodus away from their land. Israel's never been their land, but on top of that, it wasn't a forced exodus, right? Regardless, Rashida Tlaib, a representative in the United States from Michigan, Muslim and descendant of Palestinian immigrants, has recently decided to introduce a bill to the United States Congress which would formally recognize the Nakba as a matter of United States foreign policy. In other words, it would have the United States put forward a policy of formally recognizing Israel as an invading nation which forcefully displaced 700,000 Palestinians from their homeland, which would effectively be us rejecting Israel's claim to actually having the home as their own, Israel's claim to being the rightful heirs to the land, right? And on top of that, would also have us formally saying, hey, you guys are responsible for this push out of 700,000 different individuals, right? This bill was introduced on the day of the Super Blood Flower Moon. I believe, if I am remembering correctly, that was the 17th? The 19th. Doesn't matter. We're going to read about it. And yeah, so just wanted to give you guys a little bit of context there before we actually jump into the article. Let's go ahead and do that right now. All right. From the Times of Israel, this is written originally by Jacob Magid. Rashida Tlaib introduces resolution for U.S. to formally recognize Palestinian Nakba. Again, Rashida Tlaib introduces resolution for U.S. to formally recognize Palestinian Nakba. All right. The initiative, which is backed by Squad, which is these four individuals. I don't remember this one's name. I think it's like Presley. Yeah, Yana Presley, it says here in the little tab that came up. But then you also have the very popular Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. And then this woman right here is Rashida Tlaib. They have been known affectionately by the media and their supporters as the Squad because of the fact that they're incredibly young, incredibly progressive, and all female. And yeah, so but they are backing this and wanting to, basically just wanting to um, make sure this is pushed forward. Whether or not it'll happen, we'll see. But let's continue to read. Sorry. Initiative backed by squad of progressive lawmakers to mark a catastrophe of 1948, unlikely to receive a vote, represents latest broadening of Israel debate in Democratic Party. And of course, this has been something that's been going on for quite some time. Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, before the squad, have all come out and said things to the effect of Israel is bad, no good, super not dope, and Palestine needs to be more properly taken care of, or what have you. Even though you guys who are consistent watchers of this channel will know, I don't even adhere to the idea of Palestine existing. I don't think it's a real country. I don't think it's a real people group. They are Arabs. They are Levantine Arabs, to be precise. They were given a nation by virtue of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and that nation is Jordan, which exists. So they can go hang out there. It'd be roughly like me going up and saying, because I have descendants from Calgary, telling the people of Canada that Alberta was my land. And the people of Calgary would, of course, say, I'm sorry, you have an entire United States. You can go to hell. This is our land, right? And that's precisely what Israel's doing. That's precisely what Israel should do. But nonetheless, the Democratic Party has for some time been growing more and more anti-Israel for decades now. And with this new wing of incredibly progressive Democrats, you're seeing them become much more bold in their attacks against the state of Israel. Moving forward to the reading. Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan on Monday introduced the first ever congressional resolution that would see the U.S. formally recognize the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, that coincided with the establishment of Israel. The initiative was submitted on the 74th anniversary of when Palestinians commemorate their displacement and disposition during Israel's War of Independence, 1948 to 1949. It's quick to note that's slightly inaccurate. The War for Independence began in 1947, but I digress. The resolution was co-sponsored by fellow members of the so-called Progressive Squad, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Representative Ilhan Omar of Michigan, and then, excuse me, my apologies. Oh man, that was nasty. My apologies. And then also you have Representative Jamal Bowman, who is actually not a member of the squad, but nonetheless, he is a backer of the bill. He is a representative from New York. And then also Representative Cori Bush. And Cori Bush, where is Cori Bush from? She's not a member of the squad either, so I'm not sure why she's listed with them. But Missouri, just got a little fact check here. She is from Missouri. As well as Democratic Representatives Betty McCollum and Mary Newman. I'm not 100% sure where they're from, but nonetheless, you guys get the idea. It is likely that the measure won't even receive a vote, given the overwhelming support for Israel in both parties. But its submission represents the latest demonstration of the broadening debate on Israel in the Democratic Party, as sympathy with the Palestinian cause and support for a two-state solution shrinks among Republicans. Now, it is important to know Republicans have always been the more pro-Israel party. But with that being said, there are certainly those who are in the Republican Party, specifically the neocon establishment, who have not been particularly pro-Israel. It's also important to note that the two-state solution is a completely unreasonable solution that not only would have Israel give up the land, which it has more of a historical claim to, which it has more of an ancestral claim to, namely Judea and Samaria, which we today wrongfully call the West Bank, as well as Gaza. The two-state solution would suggest that those states, or that those areas, be given to Palestine for the establishment of a Palestinian state, even though those are the areas that have more of an ancestral tie, historical tie to the Jewish people, and would also see the splitting of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem being the capital of Palestine, West Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. Not only is it unreasonable for that reason, but it is also unreasonable for the reason that it would make Israel 9 miles wide at its narrowest. I'm going to say that again, 9 miles wide at its narrowest. My friends, the city of Boise in which I live is longer than 9 miles wide. That is not a joke. That is an actual fact. Sorry, this went ahead and jumped up because it does that all the time for some reason. Anyways, that's completely unreasonable. No nation on the entire planet should be expected to put itself in such a vulnerable position where you would have to cross less mileage than it takes to get from one end of Boise, Idaho to the other end of Boise, Idaho in order to completely cut the nation in half. Okay. And so for those two reasons, the two-state solution is something that all Israeli politicians should be rejecting, and all people who are pro-Israel should be rejecting. And people want to say, okay, well, what about the Palestinian people? Again, Jordan, which is 4 times the size of Israel if you include the West Bank and Gaza as part of Israel, Jordan is supposed to be the nation of Palestine. That was the agreement, not only from the 1917 Balfour Declaration, but also from the United Nations resolution in 1947. In fact, it was originally known the whole area, Israel and Jordan, was originally known as the Palestinian Mandate. And when they were splitting the Palestinian Mandate for the Arabs and Jews, it was Israel, modern Israel, including Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, that was going to be given to the Jews, and the rest of the territory, Jordan, was going to be given to the Arabs. It's not our fault, meaning the West, meaning the United Nations, meaning the United States, meaning Israel. It is not our fault that they have not accepted that land, which is 4 times the size of Israel. It is their fault. And frankly, they should be forced to accept it. And if Jordan doesn't want to accept them, they should be forced to accept them. Okay? It's not Israel's duty. It's not Israel's duty. At any rate, excuse me. The resolution acknowledges the right of return for millions of Palestinian refugees, which Israel argues would mark the end of the Jewish state. And that is, of course, true. For those of you who do not know, the right of return is an Israeli law which states that any Jewish person who has at least one Jewish grandparent is considered eligible for immigration to the state of Israel, as it is the Jewish state, as a way to encourage aliyah. Aliyah is the Hebrew word for ascent, and it is used to describe Jewish people returning to the land of Israel in Zionism. To give this right of return then to Palestinians, which is just Arabs, Levantine Arabs, would mean that all the different Levantine Arabs would then have full, no questions asked claims to citizenship in the state of Israel. And I think you guys know where this would be going. There is something like 410 million Arabs on the planet and something like 18 million Jews on the planet. Only 6 million of those Jews happen to dwell within the land of Israel. And already something like 1.4, I think, is the actual number, but it could be as high as 2 million Arabs dwell in the land of Israel, not including Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, where, again, over 1 million Arabs dwell. But then on top of that, you would have swaths of Jordanian Arabs, Syrian Arabs, Lebanese Arabs claiming right to return in the land. And let's just be perfectly frank about this, friends. If you have 6 million Jews and 7 million Arabs, it's not a Jewish state. It's that simple. Simple math problem. Oh, well, that's a little too nationalistic. I don't care. Okay? Ethno-nationalism is a positive thing. Just because we in the United States and Canada happen to have civic nationalism does not mean that nations like Ireland, Italy, Israel cannot defend the right of their native peoples, right? I think all of us would agree with that. And it's funny, actually, if you ever say, does Ireland have a right to an Irish state in the Irish homeland? Nobody bats an eye, and everybody in unison says yes. But if you say, does Israel have a right to a Jewish state in the Jewish homeland? All of a sudden, that's fascism, that's ethno-nationalism, blah, 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 yada, 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 right? Not down, not down. It's their state. They should be the majority in their state. In fact, by definition, if nothing else, that is the definitional statement behind the phrase Jewish state. A state made up primarily of Jews, right? So when Israel argues it would mark the end of the Jewish state, they're 100% right. And I'd like to point out the Rabbi Meir Kahane predicted this in the 1970s. So this is not something that's new. There have been, long before us, very wise Israeli politicians who had seen, hey, if they can't beat us with guns, then perhaps they're going to try and beat us with babies. And that's exactly what we see. It states that Israel, quote, depopulated more than 400 Palestinian villages and cities, There's actually a couple problems with that. Number one, the number is 500. Number two, Israel did not depopulate these areas. These areas left willingly when, again, the surrounding nations told them, hey, if you guys leave Israel, don't worry, you'll be able to come back in a week when we throw the Jews into the sea. That is the historically accurate version of what happened. I'm sorry to all those Palestinian people who now don't have a home. My heart does genuinely go out for you. I'm not actually just saying that. I genuinely feel for people who are homeless, for people who are sick, for people who are needy in any way, shape, or form. However, let's be honest about our histories. What happened is y'all left because y'all were expecting the surrounding Muslim and Arab nations to slaughter the Jews in mass and destroy the Jewish state, and then you were going to come back and have a great celebration on their corpses. Unfortunately, the Israeli military was too big and bad for you to do that. And so here we are in the year 2022. Regardless, back to the quote. Depopulated more than 500 Palestinian villages and cities, often demolishing all structures, planting forests over them, or repopulating them with Jewish Israelis, end quote, during the 1948 war. And again, that is just not true, but since when has Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib ever told the truth? Here's a tweet from her. She says, quote, today I introduced a resolution recognizing the Nakba, or catastrophe, where 400 Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed, over 700,000 Palestinians uprooted from their homes and made refugees. Again, the way she words it is inaccurate. She knows that. She's a liar, and you really should not trust anything that she has to say. However, this is still an incredibly important thing because Israel is the last, the United States of America is the last ally in the West which Israel actually has. And if we decide to turn against them and support the Palestinian two-state solution, which is going to happen, mark my words, it will absolutely positively happen. It's kind of sort of already happening, not only in the form of the squad, but in the form of the Donald Trump administration. Go back to Donald Trump's peace plan, and you will see that it's essentially the exact same thing as the old Vatican peace plan, which is essentially the exact same thing as the old United Nations peace plan from 1999 and 1947, respectively, where they are going to split the country, Israel proper, as the Jewish state, and Judea, Samaria, and Gaza as the Palestinian state. Then they want to split Israel, Old City being internationalized, which that's where all the holy sites are, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Temple Mount, all that kind of stuff, Western Wall, right? East Jerusalem being the capital of Palestine, West Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. This has been the plan for quite some time. And that was a plan that was fully backed by President Donald Trump. So it's not just the Progressive Squad, it's not just the United Nations, it's not just the Pope. This is something that has infiltrated all areas of establishment politics. And it will happen. It will absolutely positively happen. You mark my words. May 16th is when it happened, by the way. At any rate, the legislation claims that the Nakba is an ongoing process, pointing to Israel's establishment of hundreds of settlements and outposts in the West Bank. I feel the need to specify this is the so-called West Bank. It is properly referred to as Judea and Samaria, which is what it was referred to in ancient days. In ancient days. Tlaib, who is of Palestinian descent, also references U.S. awareness of the scale and magnitude of the Palestinian refugee crisis as it unfolded. The resolution refers to the October 1948 telegram sent from the U.S. Embassy in Israel to the Secretary of State, warning that the Arab refugee tragedy is rapidly reaching catastrophic proportions, and should be treated as a disaster, end quote. It is important that that telegram was going to members of the Secretary of State, or was coming from, members of the Secretary of State, Secretariat of State, right? The whole, what would you call that? Department. Who did not actually agree with the establishment of Israel, period. People like, for example, General George Marshall, who said that the United States, who actually left the Truman administration over its support of the state of Israel. So that's another important piece of historical context here. The resolution declares that it is U.S. policy to officially commemorate the Nakba, reject efforts to deny the Nakba, encourage educating the public on the Nakba, and continue U.S. financial support for Palestinian refugees, as well as support the implementation of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, which enshrines the Palestinian right of return and also establishes a second state. The other thing that I think is important to note here is, of course, the continued U.S. financial support for Palestinian refugees. Your Honor, we are $30 trillion in debt, and we currently have 60% of all dollars in existence having been printed in the last 2 years. And oh, yeah, by the way, we have rapid inflation. The price of milk and gasoline has nearly doubled since 2020, just as a couple of examples. But yes, let's definitely give money to people who would absolutely love to fly planes into our buildings, as evidenced by the fact that they did that. The resolution was lambasted by pro-Israel groups as well as lawmakers from both parties. Quote, the root of the catastrophe, the Arab world refused to accept the UN plan for a Jewish and Arab state in what was left of the UK's Palestine mandate after Jordan's creation, which is what I was telling you guys about earlier. Jordan is Palestine. That is the state of Palestine. They have one. It's 4 times the size of Israel. In fact, it's actually greater than 4 times the size of Israel. Instead, 5 Arab armies invaded Israel, attempting to destroy it and push the Jews into the Mediterranean Sea, end quote, tweeted the Democratic Majority for Israel. You notice that they use the same terminology I do of throwing the Israelis into the sea. That's because that's specifically what the Arab armies said. And it is language that the organization known as Hamas has actually adopted and kept in their charter to this day. Bear in mind that Hamas is one of the 2 largest Palestinian political action groups, if you choose to call them that. I choose to call them terrorist organizations, but the other one being, of course, the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is also a terrorist organization. Quote, this is another attempt by the most radical leftists in Congress to delegitimize our ally, Israel, and to promote anti-Israel and, frankly, anti-Semitic efforts to destroy the only democracy in the Middle East, end quote, said Republican Jewish Coalition Chairman Norm Coleman. And by the way, I would point out the only place where Christian Gentiles have any safety whatsoever in the Middle East. Now, it is true that Christian Jews, Messianic Jews, have to deal with a pretty good deal of persecution in the state of Israel, and that is actually a very big problem. In fact, we're probably going to start talking about that more and more as time is going on, because unfortunately it's getting worse. And those are not only our brothers and sisters in humanity, but also our brothers and sisters in Christ. And being that I am descendant of ethnic Jews, I would consider them my ethnic brothers and sisters as well. But I digress. At least for Gentile Christians, Israel is the only place in the entire Middle East where they have any safety or soundness whatsoever. Certainly not Iraq, where the Assyrians or Arameans, whatever you choose to call them, the Syriac Christians, are from. Certainly not Lebanon, where the Maronite Christians are from. Certainly not Iran, where Persian Christians are from. No, Israel is where Gentile Christians actually see some level of safety. And all flavors of Gentile Christians, by the way. Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, even the Black Hebrew Israelites. Frankly, the only group of Christians that, again, does not actually have safety in the state of Israel is Messianic Jews. And again, that is a very big problem, but there is a little bit of context for that that explains why. Not that it justifies it, it's still an absolutely terrible thing. But nonetheless, it has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of Jewish people do not consider Messianic Jews to be Jewish anymore. They see them as foregoing their Jewishness, which of course is just an utterly racist thing to say. It's very similar to when black people call black Republicans Uncle Toms, or Joe Biden saying if you have a problem with who you're going to vote for, Trump or Biden, you ain't black. You have a similar thing going on in the Jewish community when Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews and atheist Jews say, well, Jews who decide to follow the Christian religion, who agree that Jesus Christ is their Messiah, their Jewish Messiah, I might add. The Jew Jesus Christ is their Jewish Messiah in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. But at any rate, yeah, they're not really Jews anymore. It's incredibly racist, and I, for one, have no qualms about saying so. In fact, I just mentioned Rabbi Meir Kahane earlier. He's one of my heroes. He is one who had said that this was a big problem. He hated the idea of Messianic Jews. He hated the idea of missionaries. But even he was not so anti-Jewish as to ostracize that entire group, and is a group that is no longer Jewish, right? When he was asked the question, "What would you do about a Jew who had converted to Catholicism and was doing missionary work in Israel?" He said, "Well, he's a Jew, so we want to deal with him in Israel, but nonetheless, we will deal with him in Israel." Now, obviously, like I said, he was way wrong as far as his views here. He was very anti-Messianic, but he didn't go as far as most Israelis do, which is they're not even Jewish. Again, incredibly racist, in my opinion. Quote, "The fact that such a resolution could be introduced at all demonstrates that the Democratic leadership in the House is completely unwilling to or unable to rein in the worst impulses of their caucus." And by the way, this is like the 24th example of that just in the last 2 years. I mean, the idea that the Democratic leadership, not just in the House, but in the Senate, in the governor seats throughout the United States, in mayoral seats throughout the United States, in the president's executive office, on the courts, the idea that the Democratic Party has been reining in its worst impulses on any issue is utterly hilarious. They're blatantly anti Christian. See Tony Spell's persecutions. They're blatantly anti-life, see abortion. They're blatantly anti-marriage, see no-fault divorce. They're blatantly for us invading and attacking other countries, see Iraq, Vietnam, Korea, etc., which the Republican Party is just as guilty of that, by the way. I'm not saying that there's one or the other as far as the war is concerned, who's doing better. They're blatantly anti-Israel, see the article that we just read. They are blatantly pro-riot, see 2020. They are blatantly pro-shutdown, see 2020. They are blatantly pro-censorship, see 2020. 2020 was a big expose on the Democratic Party, in my own opinion. And actually, 2016 forward has been a big expose on the Democratic Party. But I digress. I certainly hope you see Jews in mass leave the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party as a result of this and the influence of Ben Shapiro and people like that, because they have nothing to gain from the incredible liberality that they have here in the United States. They've got nothing but persecutions. They've got nothing but hatred for their people, but hatred for their state. If you want to know about some of those persecutions, look at what Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo were doing in New York over COVID. All just absolutely terrible stuff. And this is just yet another example on the dozens upon dozens upon dozens of examples we've had recently. That the Democratic leadership is unwilling or unable to, not, and it's not unable, it is unwilling to rein in the worst impulses of their caucus. And of course, when it comes to the squad, even though the squad is very much against some in the Democratic establishment, they are birth of the Democratic establishment. The Democratic establishment, for a long period of time, has been saying they wanted a two-state solution. For a long period of time, has been saying climate change is an existential crisis. For a long period of time, has been saying there's nothing wrong with abortion. For a long period of time, has been saying we should have an established welfare state. For a long period of time, has been saying borders are just lines on paper and all this other kind of stuff. And then the squad came out and just admitted everything that they had been saying for a long period of time, which is, hey, we're anti-Israel, we are socialist, we want open borders, etc. And everybody's shocked. Oh my gosh, where did this come from? Well, if you had paid any attention at all to the left wing of American politics since the 1960s, you would see it came from the left wing of American politics. They're just honest about it, frankly. And really, we should have more respect for AOC, Tlaib, Omar, even though they're incredibly radical, than we do for Pelosi and Schumer and Biden, because at least the squad is honest with us. At least they tell us what they actually mean, right? You have a similar thing that happened with the Tea Party in 2010, but I digress. That's the article we have for this. Will the U.S. formally recognize the Nakba? I have to be honest with you. I think so. I think they will. I think at some point we are going to have formal United States recognition of the quote catastrophe. We are going to want to recognize, if not an Israel or a Palestinian right of return, at least a Palestinian right of return to certain areas, namely Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, which they will establish as a Palestinian state. And mark my words, friends, I know I've been wrong on some predictions, I've been right on some predictions, and we have some predictions that have yet to have any sort of manifestation, right or wrong. But I am more convinced of this one than any other prediction I've made, with the exception of one, and that is the idea that they're going to establish a World Council of Religions. We will see an establishment of a World Council of Religions, and we also will see a two-state style solution, an internationalization of the old city style solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is coming, in my opinion, barring major tragedy, meaning if I am able to live the normal 80 years, which God typically allots to his people, of course, Lord willing, we don't want to be bragging about the future, and it's all in his hands, right? But if I am allotted that time, I am 1,000% confident that I will see both of those things occur. In fact, I think we're going to see them occur in the next decade. But I digress on all of that. Will the U.S. recognize the Nakba? I think yes. Let's move on to our next article. We still got some time here today. It's once again going to be some Israeli information. By the way, I see Jamie Russell and Jerome M. have made themselves known in the live chat. Shalom to you both, and thank you very much for being here. Please consider liking and sharing this video, subscribing if you have not done so, which I think both of you guys are actually subscribed, but nonetheless, getting this out to all the different social media platforms you frequent. And of course, want to again say I appreciate you guys being here. So Israel versus Russia has become a thing. Yeah, fun fact, on the same day that the Nakba resolution was introduced, the Russian military actually shot missiles at the Israeli military. Pretty big news, is it not? This is also from the Times of Israel. In first, Russian military said to fire S-300 missiles at Israeli jets over Syria. Again, Russian military said to fire S-300 missiles at Israeli jets over Syria. TV says incident came from last week as IAF fighters departed area after alleged strike, and they were not in danger. Move could signal a significant shift in Moscow's ties with Israel. This is written by the Times of Israel staff, which means it's probably a collection of individuals. Nonetheless, it is once again from the Times of Israel. And let's go right into this. Remember when we were talking about how the Russian-Ukraine incident and how other incidents such as China, Taiwan, Israel, and Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and etc., could potentially lead to a World War III because of the entanglement of alliances which exist? Well, you're starting to see the blooming of this flower. This is partially what was being talked about on those previous episodes of the Watchdog, right? Russia is buddy-buddy with Iran, is buddy-buddy with Syria, is buddy-buddy with China, is buddy-buddy with North Korea. Or at least they are indirectly with North Korea, because China is buddy-buddy with North Korea. China's also buddy-buddy with Taliban Afghanistan, which means effectively so is Russia, right? Of course, Iran is very buddy-buddy with Palestine, which of course would mean indirectly so is Russia. In other words, you have a lot of different nations and groups which are allied with these people, or indirectly allied with these people by being allied to people who are allied with these people. You follow? And what that means is we could have war on multiple fronts if the situation in Ukraine or any of these other situations gets out of hand. I don't want people to be in a panic. God is in control. That being said, we do need to understand how this could potentially unravel, because it has unraveled in the past. See World War I. If we have war between the West and Russia, then that means we have war between the West, and China, which means effectively war between Japan and North Korea, and effectively war between Afghanistan and Iran versus Israel and Saudi Arabia. And there's probably going to be war in South Africa as well, considering the fact that Brazil is a very big partner and friend of the state of China, and so on and so forth. And this is an example of that. Moscow, since the invasion in Ukraine, has gotten more aggressive towards Israel, even though Israel is not somebody they have direct conflict with. Rather, they have conflict with, or they have alliance, rather, with Syria. Syria has alliance or has conflict rather with Israel. Going down here. Russian forces opened fire on Israeli jets with advanced S-300 anti-aircraft missiles at the end of an alleged IAF attack on targets in northwestern Syria last week, Channel 13 News reported Monday, in what could signal a significant shift in Moscow's attitude toward Israel. One more time. Russian forces opened fire on Israeli jets with advanced S-300 anti-aircraft missiles at the end of an alleged IAF attack on targets in northwestern Syria last week, Channel 17 News or 13, News reported on Monday, in what could signal a significant shift in Moscow's attitude toward Israel. According to the unsourced report, the unprecedented incident occurred on Friday night when the Israeli Air Force bombed several targets near the city of Mysyaf, in northwestern Syria. At least 5 people were killed and 7 were hurt in the airstrike, Syria's state news agency said. Other media in the country said 6 were killed, all crew members of a Pantsir air defense system who attempted to take down the Israeli missiles. The report said the Syrian military fired off dozens of anti-aircraft missiles, which have been largely ineffective at halting the hundreds of Israeli strikes on Syria in recent years. However, this time the S-300 batteries also opened fire as the jets were departing the area, Channel 12 said. The report noted that Syria's S-300 batteries were operated by the Russian military and cannot be fired without their approval. Again, operated by the Russian military and cannot be fired without their approval. Remember when I said that it was possible Vladimir Putin is dying and that we might see some irrational behavior or at least more erratic behavior from him as a result? Well, I don't mean to say I told you so, but ding, 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 ding. Here we are. The report said that the S-300 radar did not manage to lock the Israeli jets and thus did not present a serious threat to the IAF fighter jets. If confirmed, however, this would mark the first use of the S-300s against the IAF over Syria and would be a worrying development for Israel, which has carried out hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria in the course of the country's civil war and since, targeting what it says are arms shipments bound for Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah terror group and other Iranian-linked sites. Of course, Hezbollah is an anti-Israel, pro-Palestine group. It is Islamist. They are based in the nation of Lebanon, and their goal is to establish a Shia 12er Islamic state in Palestine. Israel rarely acknowledges or discusses such operations, and there was no confirmation of the raid or the S-300 launch from the IDF. The Channel 13 report said it was not immediately clear if the S-300 missile fire was a one-time event or if it was a Russian signal to Israel that it was changing its policy. The Mysyaf area is thought to be used as a base for Iranian forces and pro-Iranian militias and has been repeatedly targeted in recent years in attacks attributed to Israel. Satellite imagery taken after the strike showed that an underground facility has been completely destroyed. You can actually see pictures of that here. Here is the structure. Here is what is now left of the structure. The report comes amid a deterioration in ties between Israel and Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. Israel has tried to walk a fine line between Moscow and Kiev, or Kiev, I think is actually how you pronounce that, but has recently become more critical of Russia as evidence emerged of Russian atrocities and growing anti-Semitic rhetoric from Russian leaders. Now, to be fair to Russia here, the Ukrainians have also been committing war crimes. Both groups of people have been killing war prisoners. The Russians have also been killing citizens and bombing like schools and areas like that. I'm not saying this in support of Russia, but fair is fair. It is important to note that both sides are certainly engaged in war crimes. It is also important to note that both sides are definitely engaged in anti-Semitism. It's a little bit more obvious on the Russian side simply because Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, is a Jew. But there are very, very many white supremacist neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, and it's a problem to say the least. It's a problem, right? That said, obviously, that none of those things are said in support of Russia. It's just as a matter of being fair to Russia. Back to the article. Russia, a close ally of Syria's Bashar Assad, has forces based and operating in Syria. Beyond providing Syria with its air defenses, Moscow also maintains state of the art S 400 air defense systems to protect its own assets in Syria, but has never turned them on Israeli planes. Without specifically mentioning the incident, Defense Minister Benny Gantz on Monday said Israel would not be deterred and vowed to prevent Iran from transferring advanced capabilities to other entities in Syria. Quote, the state of Israel will continue to act against any enemy that threatens it and prevent the transfer of advanced capabilities from Iran and endanger the citizens of Israel and harm the stability of the entire region. Gantz said during a visit, end quote, Gantz said during a visit to the military's northern command. Israel has long accused Iran of transferring advanced munitions to the Lebanese Hezbollah terror group via Syria. In recent years, Israel and Russia established a so-called deconfliction hotline, excuse me, to keep the sides from getting tangled up and accidentally clashing over Syria. While meeting in Sochi last year, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed that the two nations would continue to implement the mechanism. Bennett said at the time that Israel's relationship with Russia is strategic in nature and noted the importance of the intimate discourse with the Russian military. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met Putin on multiple occasions to discuss the issue and claimed that their personal relationship was the main factor in keeping the mechanism in place. In 2018, Russia provided the advanced S-300 air defense systems to Syria's military free of charge, transferring 3 battalions with 8 launchers, each to the Assad regime, despite strenuous objection from Israel and the U.S. We actually reported on that back then. We weren't yet on YouTube, though, so that's probably lost to time because everything we had on Facebook has been lost. Russia's delivery of the S-300 system to Syria followed the downing of a Russian spy aircraft by Syrian forces that were responding to an Israeli strike over Syrian airspace. Russia blamed Israel for the incident, which killed 15 Russian crew members. Israel and its allies for years have lobbied Russia not to give Syria and other regional players the S-300 system, arguing that it would limit Israel's ability to neutralize threats, including Hezbollah. And that's the end of that article there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have some very interesting news then, right? Coming out of the state of Israel. It appears like we are getting closer and closer and closer to a real possibility of world war. We have not only what's going on in Ukraine with Russia fighting Ukraine, but also now Russia is fighting with Israel, which of course is going to embolden Iran to fight with Israel, which of course is going to strengthen Saudi Arabia's alliance with Israel. We also have in the Far Eastern region, China being emboldened against Taiwan. President Biden has recently said some pretty emboldened things against China in regards to Taiwan. And surrounding that whole region include allies of the United States who would certainly get involved, such as the Philippines and South Korea and Japan, right? On top of that, you will have some nations which would likely get involved on the other side. For example, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Indonesia, namely because of their very strong ties to Islam and the ties of China to both Afghanistan and Iran. It's that kind of indirect, a couple degrees of separation alliances that I was just talking about. It's a big entangled web, a damned foolish feast, as I have once called it. But I digress. Some more to be discussing today. Will the Russian Orthodox Church be removed from the World Council of Churches? Newsflash, or excuse me, not newsflash, but spoiler alert, no. But they are talking about it, and so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it here today. This comes from the Church Times, Should the WCC expel the Russian Orthodox Church? This was published on May 20th, 2022, my 24th birthday, fun fact. In a frank exchange of letters, I'm totally going to mispronounce this, I'm sorry. Paul Ostreicher and Rowan Williams expressed different views. And again, what are they expressing views on? Whether or not the Russian Orthodox Church should be removed from the World Council of Churches, which is currently the largest Christian ecumenical group in the world, including most evangelical, Protestant, Reformed, etc. churches, as well as most Orthodox communions and Oriental Orthodox communions as well. Now, this is in the form of 2 letters that we're reading. So it's going to sound a little weird with my reading it, but nonetheless, here we go. My dear Rowan, I very seldom disagree with you. When I do, I begin to wonder which one of us comes closer to discipleship. I am not sure whether this letter will help us find the answer, but it will be an attempt. Should the Russian Orthodox Church be expelled from the World Council of Churches? It seems that we have come up with opposite answers. I am a child of 20th century ecumenism. Christian unity has been one of my ideals. The WCC is an imperfect but important embodiment of the gospel imperative, and for that reason, I thought it unthinkable to expel a member church, however wayward. All of us have sinned individually and corporately, and all of us need forgiveness. Now, of course, while I certainly echo that all of us have sinned individually and corporately and all need forgiveness, I would like to say that I am, for one, a major enemy of 20th century ecumenism, which has spread into 21st century pluralism. See Pope Francis. There is no reason for us to have communion with the Catholic Church, with the Orthodox Church, frankly, even with some Protestant churches. Unity is great, but unity must be held in truth. Let me say it again. Unity is great, but unity must be held in truth. We cannot unify over Christ if we have completely and totally opposite understandings of what that means. Doesn't mean we have to hate each other. Doesn't mean we even have to anathematize each other. There is on my other channel, a good friend of mine, Veckel. Well, you know, as far as doing these videos are concerned, right? Good friend, but nonetheless, comes on the channel frequently. He has said that while he thinks that an annihilationist is somebody who's his Christian brother, he doesn't think he should have communion with them because he disagrees and it's not part of his theology. I don't have any problem with that. In other words, just because you don't have active communion with someone doesn't mean that you have to be anathematizing them, throwing the heretic label, hating them, anything like that. It does mean you should not have unity with people who you fundamentally do not agree with, right? We should not be in communion with people when we have a completely different understanding of what the Bible is teaching. But nonetheless, there are precedents. The pro-apartheid churches of South Africa were not expelled. This was not fence-sitting. The WCC's policy was unambiguous. Eventually, these churches repented. The WCC's policy on the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just as clear. Patriarch Kirill and his entourage, on the other hand, give their total support to Putin's war. Nevertheless, I have opposed their expulsion. You have advocated it, no doubt, for well-considered reasons, and it gives a link to an article here. My motivation is not only to affirm Christian unity. Expulsion will also exclude the courageous Russian Christians who, at great cost to themselves, project Putin's war. The hierarchy is not the church. Expulsion will also make even more difficult the conversion to end the killing that the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury have tried to initiate. Excuse me. I had an exchange with my friend Professor Fernando Enns, a member of the WCC's Central Committee, which will have to decide the issue before the WCC Assembly convenes in Germany later this year. He agrees with me on the grounds that Christian solidarity precludes the expulsion of a member church. He refers to an analogy with the Nazi-supporting Deutsche Christian movement in Hitler's Germany, with the majority of German Protestants supported. which the majority of German Protestants supported. Excuse me. The analogy with Russia is accurate. There was not yet a WCC. This analogy, however, made me think: should I, in 1939, have accepted the Deutsche Christen, Christians who favored the expulsion of the Jews in the ecumenical family? And I am not so sure. Patriarch Kirill blesses an unjust, illegal war, reminding me as I say this that my own Church of England never condemned the illegal invasion of Iraq with its catastrophic consequences and celebrated Britain's nuclear-armed submarines in Westminster Abbey, Abbey. And it gives another link to an article from May the 10th, 2019. Not to speak of the aborted British attack on Egypt, just as the Red Army was shooting the people on the streets in Budapest. Who's in, who's out? What are the principles at issue? What matters more, Christian solidarity or a righteousness that affirms our one humanity under God? Is the church or is humanity not the actual body of Christ? Now, of course, the church is the body of Christ. And, of course, Christian solidarity, meaning the linking of churches with each other, is less important than us affirming, humanity's inherent value. As stated in Genesis, man is made in God's image and therefore should not have his life taken away from him, right? But all of that disregards what the actual central issue should be, which is the most important thing: righteousness in Christ, which is why we cannot be allied with such people. Putting the debate in these terms has not resolved the WCC's dilemma, if dilemma it is. The issue is profoundly theological and certainly not simple, or it is simpler than, simpler than I can get my mind around. Rowan, I'm grateful to you for prompting these reflections. I shall share them with some of our friends. May we be led along the Emmaus Road. Blessings from the South Seas and in Terreo, the Maori language. Much love, Aruhanui. I think that's how you say that, Aruhanui. I don't know. I don't speak Maori. Next letter from the guy he wrote the letter to. This is from Rowan Williams. My dear Paul, I'm very grateful for your thoughts on this issue. Like you, I am used to convergence in our responses to many issues, and the fact that we're not entirely one on this matter is cause for reflection. Thank you for your thoughts on it. But just to clarify, I have said that I think there is a strong case for the exclusion of the Moscow Patriarchate from the WCC, and that they have a case to answer. I'm not suggesting that they should have no opportunity for such an answer. I don't feel sanguine about their willingness to defend themselves in this particular court, but I wish not advocate any precipitate decision without notice and consultation. I have a stutter sometimes, and so it makes it difficult for me to say words with multiple syllables, so I apologize for that. Should it come to this, however, my reasons for supporting an exclusion would be that we have a situation in which the hierarchy of one particular Christian organization is actively advocating, not merely passively acquiescing in, a war of pure aggression in which the routine slaughter of non-combatants is evidently a matter of accepted policy, and which is being presented by this hierarchy as a defense of Christian civilization. One immediate consequence in that those who are technically members of the Patriarchate's own jurisdiction are being killed, with his sanction, by other members of his own flock. This is not in and of itself more dreadful than the general pattern of civilian slaughter, but it focuses on why there is a problem about who is seen to stand alongside the Patriarch. Ecclesial credibility must surely be deeply compromised in such a case. It's not just a matter of the failing or weakness or even sinfulness of certain individuals, but of the highest authority in a church publicly sanctioning a notorious evil. Of course, theologically speaking, we remain in some sense members of the body of Christ together, and at a deep level, we are called to solidarity with those in error and sin. This should not be an excuse for self-congratulation and the rush to parade a pure and uncompromised orthodoxy. Now, of course, that is precisely the problem that I have with this ecumenism, is they really don't care about a pure and precise orthodoxy. They care more about the fact that we all claim the same title and therefore we should all be good friends. I personally think, as egregious as this is, and it is egregious, it is absolutely egregious, but as egregious as this is, I personally find it somewhat offensive that it is something political like warfare, which can get people to say, hey, maybe this whole ecumenical thing is not a great idea, or at least is not absolutely a great idea, rather than the incredibly stark contrast we have theologically, such as our understanding of Jesus Christ's person, or our understanding of how salvation occurs, or our understanding of the infallibility of the church fathers. Theologically speaking, when it comes to communion with other ecclesiastical bodies, it is my opinion that those things are much greater in their importance than political issues, even political issues which lead to people being killed. And by the way, that is not to say that this is not an important thing. I, for one, if I was Russian Orthodox, probably would leave the church over this. Now, of course, there's theological reasons I would never be Russian Orthodox, but regardless, it is certainly a massive problem when you have the indiscriminate slaughter of people who are supposed to be members of your own flock by members of your own flock. And it's a problem if you have the indiscriminate slaughter of people at all by members of your flock. The United States government, excuse me, not the United States government. I don't know why I said that. The religion of Christianity is not a religion of sword and conquest, period. Never has been, never will be. Read the book for yourself. That being said, though, the greater issues are certainly the theological issues, and it is incredibly disheartening and shows the political nature of the World Council of Churches to hear that this is, in fact, the problem they have and not the problems that those of us who are non-ecumenical have. I think we share a skepticism. This is back to the letter. I think we share a skepticism about anything that would just be a comfortable colonizing of moral high ground. But membership in the WCC is not the same as communion in the body of Christ. It is not a question of excommunication, which the other Orthodox churches, would have to consider, but of what kind of legitimacy is given to the Muscovite leadership by its continued membership as an international body of Christian communities. You rightly note the debates about the Deutsche Christian in the 1930s. Bonhoeffer's argument was that a fundamentally anti-Christian agenda was being advanced by the group, and that the ecumenical movement should not be giving this any credibility. This is not, I think, an absolution of or collusion with the failings and sins of other churches. I'd be the last to whitewash the record of my own church in the days of Suez or Iraq, but it is fair to say that even those least critical of government decisions in such contexts did not present those decisions as a matter of positive Christian obligation or sanction the deliberate targeting of non-combatants. Although, to be fair, numerous other churches in the past certainly have, including the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Oriental Orthodox churches, Lutherans, the Catholic Church. This is another reason why I don't like denominations. I'm not interested in politics in my church. With the exclusion of the Patriarchate from the WCC, or excuse me, would the exclusion of the Patriarchate from the WCC actually make it harder for Christians and other dissidents in Russia? I think this is a very good question. I'm not completely sure of the answer, and I'd like to know how more of this might feel on the ground. But I suspect, not without some evidence from Orthodox friends, that at least some dissidents would say that their situation could hardly be worse given the legal penalties that can be inflicted on them and the already extreme pressure from the hierarchy. The question has been weighed, against the fact, for example, the conversions between the Archbishop of Canterbury or Pope Francis. Hang on, one more time. The question, sorry, my dog is being noisy. The question has to be weighed against the fact that, for example, the conversations between the Archbishop of Canterbury or Pope Francis and the Patriarch have been very efficiently spun by the Patriarchate as implying that the churches of Western Europe are agnostic about the rights and wrongdoings of the invasion, and continuing membership of the WCC risks being instrumentalized in that way. These are some of the considerations that weigh with me. The hard question is whether the blessings of this war by the Patriarchate is so different in its level of gravity that it merits unprecedented action of the sort that we're discussing here. I doubt whether, had the WCC existed in 1936, say, the Deutsche Christian could have been long tolerated in its membership because of its active advocacy of something fundamentally destructive of the nature of the body of Christ, and I'm not using the phrase in a narrowly ecclesiastical sense. In the present policy, Hang on just 1 second, friends. In the present ecclesiastical sense, or in the present policy of the Moscow Patriarchate, excuse me, to be seen in this light, is it to be seen in this light, excuse me. I'm still inclined to think that it is, and it must therefore, with all due humility and with all due recognition of shared responsibility, be called to account. I don't say this. I don't say this lightly, given my long association with and learning from the Russian Church, but it is partly because of my love for its tradition that I don't want to see it become the prisoner of a deeply destructive national mythology. Thank you again for writing. This is no easy matter, and I hope our common thoughts and prayers may continue to enable discernment for both of us and for our friends. With love in Christ as always, Rowan. Now, will this end up occurring? No, I don't think it will. I don't think it will. I think the World Council of Churches is going to continue to grow and grow and grow and grow until eventually all churches are in some way, shape, or form linked with them. But with that being said, it is something that is being actively discussed, and so it is something that I wanted to bring up. I also think it very much exposes the political nature of the World Council of Churches and the disregarding of their religious nature. But with that being said, friends, we are currently done here. So if you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing to this channel. Or liking this video rather, and subscribing to this channel. Please consider hitting that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Lord willing, we are going to be live next on 1 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time this Thursday, where we'll be discussing some of the stuff we didn't get to today, such as Taiwan, as well as other things. Please consider getting this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? Please also consider giving to the Patreon if you see fit. Obviously, please only do so if you see fit. Please only do so if you feel that it's worth it. But if you do feel that it's worth it, giving to either the Patreon or the PayPal is something that is greatly accepted, and it will help me turn this into a career at some point in time. And I greatly appreciate anybody who does that in advance, as well as those who are already currently doing so. Want to remind you guys to be watchdogs. Want to remind you that we are living in biblical times, and I want to ask you guys a very important question. That is, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise